get this out of the way. All righty. Hello, this and that, 18 February. Um, I began or I ended yesterday talking about the Saints de Cecilia um, article on subsumption. And yes, I've talked about subsumption, and I suppose I'm going to bore people to tears. But what subsumption does or is a way of talking about ultimately the issues of trying to talk about a Marxian theory of value. Now, whether it's a labor theory of value is, sort of up in the air, but I think that the reason why it's up in the air, of course, is because you didn't have the kind of knowledge economy that we were talking about, but has been extended back into the 17th century by other scholars, as I mentioned before. And so we can talk about, and we should talk about, a kind of knowledge economy, or as some people refer to it, a cognitive capitalism. And whether you do or you don't account for labor itself, that is, or the difference between labor in the David Ricardo sense and labor power, as Marx gets to eventually, that shouldn't matter. There's a system of abstraction going on, and subsumption is a way of describing at least the logic of abstraction. And it doesn't disappear in the 21st century or the 20th century. I mean, the idea is that something goes on, and if you look conceptually at subsumption is used in a variety of ways. Some people have applied it in computer programming or computer science, um, as a way of talking about certain types of branch structures. And subsumption is also used in psychology to talk about a certain way of learning, structuring learning. I assume it's a kind of extension of a kind of constructivist approach, and there's even a reference to Vygotsky in it. But anyway, we digress. Um, it can relate, I think, to the way in which you organize the logic in as we were talking before a couple of weeks ago. The social ontology is talking about somewhat of the same thing. And it would be useful to actually have reasonable conversations with people about what that is or isn't. And I probably am going to write something and fly it by some people to see if it makes any sense. Um, so I brought in another author, and what he does is talk a little bit more about cognitive capitalism, and I think it does relate to subsumption. Eventually, it does. I think. In conclusion, in cognitive capitalism, the relation of capital to labor is presented as the opposition of two logics, between which it no longer seems possible to restabilize a dialectic of struggles/development. On the one hand, the logic of capital accumulation, which assumes an ever more parasitic nature through its attempt to enforce the law of value artificially. And then, on the other hand, the logic of the new figure of the collective worker, the diffuse intellectuality in the brain of which is all of the accumulated knowledge in society, and which holds the totality of prerequisites for a self-management of the conditions and social ends of production. It is around these contradictions that some of the most essential questions of the critique of the political economy of the knowledge-based economy and a political project for the overcoming of cognitive capitalism are posited. You see, we have to get through the idea of what the contours of what a cognitive capitalism is, even as we now see it, it's being subverted by very simple vandalism or nihilism, I suppose, in the U.S. context, um, which is a bad thing. I mean, you may think it has an anarchistic goal. No, it actually has a capitalist goal. It is simply to destabilize um, certain institutions so that capital can be redistributed, but not downward, but rather upward, and so that the rich will get richer. And those who are, and I think it's purely pathological now that you sort of can see that Musk is not a logical person. He is, he's on the spectrum. He's got issues, um, which are, just available to us. And similarly for Trump, he just, he doesn't care anymore. It's a pure, narcissistic supply, whatever. So, and yes, you could say that the pathological logic of the GOP operates that way. But anyway, back to subsumption. So I began this a little bit yesterday, and I think I can get through it today, and then perhaps begin the other little piece that I added onto this. And I put in a little thing on early Marx that has Heinrich talking about it. It's a fairly recent, I think it's a couple of months or so. And I included a little thing where, what's his name, Peter Winston at MIT is talking about subsumption, but purely in the context of computer science, which is actually kind of interesting in and of itself. But that's for those who might be amused by that. Andres Saints de Cecilia, subsumption counts amongst those concepts of philosophical provenance that are taken up by Marx and recorded as critical social concepts. Originating as a logical category, subsumption nonetheless describes for Marx something fundamental about both the basic structure and the developmental tendencies of capitalist societies. Subsumption is, in a sense, the crucial logical figure of capitalist relations, insofar as these relations are founded on the systematically perpetuated subordination of labor to capital. Without this subsumption, there can be no exploitation of surplus value, and so no accumulation and expanded reproduction of capital. This concept of subsumption, however, has a somewhat ambiguous status within Marx's thought. The term appears repeatedly from Marx's early to late writings, yet nowhere is it subject by Marx to a rigorous treatment, and so no explicit theory of subsumption is presented in his writings. What the reader of Marx appears to be confronted with is little more than scattered fragments and indications, allusions to a more substantial position that never appears, or that in Capital, the book, is structurally repressed by the systematizing impulse that governs the movement of Marx's discourse. The ambiguities and apparent ambivalence expressed in Marx's use of the term has been the cause of wide-ranging debates over the uses and misuses of the concept and its relevance for a critical engagement with contemporary reality, spanning assertions of its irrelevance or even its theoretical counterproductivity to readings that elevate it as the primary concept characterizing the configuration of contemporary or late capitalism. We saw that before. In this chapter, I consider three aspects of subsumption as a Marxist concept. Number one, its philosophical prehistory, especially in the work of Kant and Hegel, an appreciation of which I argue is crucial to grasping the depth of its significance within Marxist theory. I'm going to skip that portion and go to towards the end. Number two, Marx's conceptualization of subsumption, both at a general level in relation to his materialist methodology and as capitalist subsumption in his critique of political economy, and finally, key interpretations and debates pertaining to subsumption within the Marxist tradition. So we get to, there's a whole bunch of things on Kant and Hegel and blah, 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 blah. We get to a description of what the author considers hybrid subsumption. Alongside the discussions of formal and real subsumption, Marx also mentions the existence of various hybrid forms, as Zwitterformen through which surplus value is extorted by capitalists without the labor process being formally subsumed. And so this is interesting because it's not fully. This is it unproductive? Is it unpaid? What is it? Like formal and real subsumption, an economic relationship underpins such exploitation, but without the mediation of a direct wage and without the ownership and control of the labor process by the capitalist. So you can see that there's something going on here, and it could be defined simply in terms of property or property relation. So that's another thing to think about. Instead, by monopolizing the market for the purchase of the producer's goods or through advances of money, materials, or land needed for production, the capitalist is effectively able to extract a surplus from the producer without purchasing and commanding their labor power. So there's a whole bunch of things that are possible here, including a whole bunch of Frankfurt School stuff that there's a kind of self repression as well as whatever. Anyway, Jairus Banerjee has also described the economic relationship implied by hybrid subsumption as effectively constituting a concealed wage, which that's worth yakking about a lot. The capitalist here functions formally as middleman, as merchant, or alternatively as a usurer feeding on the producer like a parasite. Though ultimately the result is the same as with other modes of subsumption, that is, exploitation and accumulation. Hybrid subsumption presupposes that formally independent producers are willing to enter into exploitative relationships even in the absence of political restraints obliging them to do so in order to gain access to the money or means of production needed to secure their means of subsistence. The existence of such hybrid forms must therefore be associated with, on the one hand, processes of accumulation by dispossession. That's a very big deal for Harvey. And the concentration, because you can explain all the, kind of settler colonialism and stuff with that. And the concentration of wealth and means of production by a capitalist class alongside, and on the other, the propagation of money-mediated market relations. That's uncontroversial. Marx refers to hybrid subsumption in two primary senses, although a vast diversity of concrete scenarios, both historical and contemporary, is covered by the concept. Hybrid forms can be transitional, the Übergangsformen, serving as the basis for the historical emergence of formal subsumption at the dawn of capitalist production. But they also endure or emerge anew as accompanying forms, Nebenformen, as opposed to Übergangsformen, whatever, alongside properly capitalist production relations based on formal or real subsumption. In this sense, hybrid forms are not restricted to residual or anachronistic forms of exploitation, but rather constitute a permanently present strategy of exclusion and outsourcing, which capitalists can employ as a strategic response to both competitive pressures and the resistance of workers. I could argue that that's going on right now. You can depopulate the federal government, but you're going to have all these unemployed people, with some of whom have fairly decent technical skills. And so what are you doing is you're putting them out of work so that perhaps you can employ them in the private sector, and the capitalist brain will go, well, we just re-exploit all these people. So that's kind of what we're thinking of doing. And of course, it is a transfer of knowledge as well as a transfer of wealth. Periodization and total subsumption. Within the Marxist canon, the concept of subsumption remains a relatively under-theorized term, having received less scholarly and political engagement than concepts such as alienation, exploitation, reification, or abstraction. This neglect derives at least in part from its limited textual presence in Marx's writings and an apparent ambivalence on Marx's behalf with regard to its theoretical status. and I'm curious to read what Gil Skillman, who's at Wesleyan, thinks about this. The most sustained accounts of capitalist subsumption are developed by Marx in early drafts of his Critique of Political Economy, the result of the immediate production process, and the 1861 to 63 manuscripts. Yet the term subsumption was almost entirely omitted from the published volumes of Capital, with the earlier drafts in question becoming available relatively late on in the formation of both the orthodox and critical Marxist traditions. Nonetheless, amongst the various attempts to revitalize and reinvent the critique of capitalist society in the wake of the failures of historical communisms of various stripes, a number of significant contributions invoke subsumption as a central critical category, in particular, the writings of Theodore W. Adorno of the Frankfurt School, Jacques Camus, and Antonio Negri all draw on subsumption as a category with which to theorize the developmental dynamics of capitalist power. Now, remember, we've talked about this kind of dynamics in terms of valorizing, the difference between Department 1 and Department 2, the idea of turnover. There's all of those things are kind of part of the developmental dynamics. You talk about, it's not a static model. Now, the problem, of course, is even if you say it's not a static model, you propose that, okay, there's an equilibrium. How dynamic is that equilibrium? And often I think that the problem is that equilibriums can be conceived problematically. And I think John Romer has sort of shown that, but maybe I'm wrong on that. Despite their emergence against the backdrop of diverse political and cultural contexts, common to these approaches is an understanding of subsumption as a category concerned primarily with the historical transformation of capitalist relations, either through the periodization of distinct phases of capitalism mapped onto the formal/real subsumption distinction and corresponding to different modes of exploitation and resistance, as with Antonio Negri, or in the progressive extension and expansion of capitalist relations such that they begin to encompass all hitherto non-commodified realms of life, such as culture and leisure. Now, there's a bone to pick on whether they're non-commodified, but anyway, what Adorno and Horkheimer identified as the development towards total integration. The work of Adorno established the first serious attempt after Marx to deploy the concept of subsumption. And let me point out to you that there is a critical theory working group that's been organized in the South, and they've just come up with a new edition, and I can refer you to that. They're going to have a group of probably of writing things coming up. Anyway. However, rather than building upon Marx's analysis of different forms of subsumption, Adorno's use of the category is more directly grounded in its prior philosophical conceptualizations and critique, particularly Kantian epistemology and its Hegelian metacritique, and that's discussed above. In the first place, this philosophical legacy provided Adorno with a model for the fate of social individuals in modern societies based on the formative schematizing processes specified by German idealism, in which the particular is adequated to the universal in a manner that abstracts away any excessive individuality. Now, this sort of crisis of subjective versus objective, or if it is that, is problematic. This template of identifying judgment is manifest concretely for Adorno in the reduction of the overwhelming mass of the population to mere objects of administration. Now, I don't want to get too far off, but the mere objects of administration, this is the same administration of the administrative state that Steve Bannon talks about. So anyway, this I think is what is interesting and important. Anyway, which forms them as passive and powerless, nullified individuals via, in the most extreme case, the complete abstraction of subsumed human beings under arbitrary concepts to which they are made to fit. So this idea of, is it the Borg? Are you being assimilated in that particular context? And, that is this abstraction question. The difference between labor and labor power is, I'd like to think, sort of an example of that you need, as I've mentioned before in prior little sessions, that you're um, creating a kind of administrative construct of some kind, because that's what you have to do anyway. You have to sort of organize production in such a way that to make it more efficient, to make the commodities move faster or whatever. As Adorno's correspondent, Alfred Sohn-Rethel, or Sohn-Rethel, emphasized, the connection with subsumption here is not mere analogy, given the practical rather than merely theoretical character of the abstraction involved in commodity exchange. In relating commodities quantitatively on the basis of their exchange value, whilst bracketing the qualitative heterogeneity of their specific properties, individuals do not just think abstractly, but actualize a real conceptual operation socially, concretizing subsumption under the forms of capitalist value as a real abstraction, with real effects at the level of the social form determination of both objects and subjects. Now, let me break there, and I've been intervening throughout this, but you can extrapolate from this in various ways. In the 20th century, the idea of a kind of modernity, the abstraction that modernity represents, and its resultant subjectivity, you can see in various social forms, not to, sort of reify them, but, to say that the attraction to the modern age, the attraction to, Italian futurism, we could use that as an example of the attraction to not the trains themselves, but the fact of movement, for example, or auto cars or whatever, that to look at the abstraction in a slightly different way, not so much as objects, but as process. In the second place, for Adorno, this procedure of social schematization demonstrates a developmental tendency towards extensive and intensive, this extensive and intensive absolutization, advancing along the twin vectors of industrialization and production and mass culture in consumption. The dynamic of subsumption under exchange value displays a movement towards the total administration of social subjects. Individuals in capitalism find themselves dominated both in work and leisure, subject to a form of control that not only regulates their outward action in relation to others, but comes to preform their innermost identity, desires, and personality in a manner that dissolves any real autonomy. However, Adorno is conspicuously vague about the precise mechanisms by which this tendential colonization of the inner and outer life world is driven, and it is here that the limits of his account are evident. By giving primacy to commodity relations, the exchange abstraction, in his account of the functioning of capitalist power, Adorno elides the key mechanism identified in Marx's critique of political economy, through which capital progressively transforms the world in its own image, whilst deepening its domination of human societies. The real subsumption of the labor process enacted by virtue of capitalist control over production. Constrained by his circulationist standpoint, that is, grounding the exchange abstraction in the meta-narrative of enlightenment and instrumental reason rather than any theory of accumulation, Adorno can only allude to the processes of material domination that flow with apparent automaticity from the commodification of labor and capitalist ownership of the production process. Adorno's critique of capitalist society thus remains formal, unable to extend its analytic framework in a manner that would also encompass the concrete, expanded reproduction of capitalist social relations. Now, the effect of this formalism is that, ironically, for all of Adorno's Kantianism, he fails to incorporate the key innovation introduced by Kant into the thought of subsumption. That is, the problem of the specific mechanisms of form determination that must be operative if universal and particular are to attain and maintain identity. The residual idealism of this epistemologically inflected approach leads Adorno to a reductive and one-sided theory of capitalist subsumption that can offer no substantial account of how and why capitalist power advances as it does. In fact, our current situation is, how is it that crazy, stupid people can get power? By contrast, the writings of Antonio Negri, developed from the 1980s onward, draw directly on Marx's concept of subsumption in order to map and differentiate distinct material configurations of capital's command over labor, extending and intensifying the implications of the transition from formal to real subsumption, and in the context of historical periodization of capitalism. Whilst Negri's approach, along with the tradition of operaismo, from which this the Italian, sort of worker theory, post-war worker theory, from which it stems, departs from a Marxian analysis of production, exploitation, and resistance. Much like Adorno, he identifies a progressive historical deepening of this relation of command that comes to exceed the boundaries of the traditional sites of production, eventually encompassing and internalizing every sphere of human activity within the matrix of capitalist power. You could argue that social media facilitates that in the 21st century. Transposing Marx's analysis of subsumption from the individual labor process to the social whole, Negri refers to this historical completion as the real and total subsumption of labor and world society under capital. For Negri, this totalization of subsumption marks the point at which capitalist socialization ceases to be mediated by commodification and value relations, and there's no longer any outside to capitalist authority, because the mechanism of the production and reproduction of labor power is wholly internal to capital. So this is that dynamic argument we've talked about before. This is what happens when faster turnover occurs, for example. It's not all embodied in that, but you can see little reflections of it in that. And yet, they're problematic because they're still manifestations of capitalism. So you could argue, and I'm not going to argue it here, and because I would probably ask this stupid question in a conference about this, but, is Taylorization, for example, that is, time and motion studies, et cetera, to speed up capitalist assembly, symptomatic of that? Now, instead of capitalist power being regulated by the law of value, as it is for Marx, once there's no external domain left from which to extract the differential determination of measure, and with it the possibility of a surplus value, that power metamorphoses into a generalized logic of pure command akin to the military-style discipline of the factory regime. To whatever extent capitalist social relations may continue to take the appearance of economic relations, the dynamic of subsumption transforms their essence towards a purely political logic of antagonism. Society is configured in a disciplinary way through the development of the capitalist system. In Negri's theorization, total capitalist subsumption is the situation in which we have found ourselves since the middle of the 20th century. That may be the result. Let me break here and say, maybe that's the whole issue of the post-World War II economy, blah, 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 blah. Rendering Marx's account of commodification and its corresponding value theoretical analysis of exploitation and fetishism an anachronistic framework that no longer has traction on social life and its conflicts. That's taking a little too far, perhaps. In place, Negri constructs an ontological framework in which the creative plenitude of labor is directly subsumed under a capitalist command, which absorbs and appropriates its capacities without the mediation of competitive measure. Much like taking over the Kennedy Center, I suppose. Yet Negri's theoretical dissolution of value as the regulating principle of capitalist power gives rise to a series of theoretical contradictions and aporias. Aporias are gaps, are absences. Most importantly, Negri's absolutization of subsumption effectively suspends the conflictual character of the subsumptive relation itself. For once subsumption has been achieved, there's no longer any tension between the universal and the particular. That is, between capital and labor, as they are bound together by an analytically perfect identity. If conflict is thus to appear within Negri's account of subsumption, it can only be in the transmuted form of the immanent ontological opposition of full time and empty time, represented respectively by the creativity of labor and the abstract totalization of capital. Here, however, a robust account of the concrete mechanisms of subsumption and the social forms taken by the antagonism between capital and labor is lacking, leading Negri, like Adorno, to a one-sided development of Marx's initial theorization of the concept. The coherence of a Marxist theory of subsumption depends on the integration of the formal dimension of exchange and commodification with the material configuration of production and the tendential transformations of the labor process. Now, that's, you probably should work through that a little better. Without both of these aspects, capitalist domination cannot be comprehended in the historical specificity of its operation and developmental dynamics, whereas Adorno tends to treat subsumption as if it were an automatic effect of exchange relation, that is, an epistemological conception concerned primarily with formal determination. Negri inverts this and understands subsumption only through the material logic of capitalist control over generalized productive activity, an ontological conception of subsumption grounded in the idea of an original, vital, and creative plenitude possessed by labor, which capital confiscates. Neither approach, however, thinks the two sides of capitalist domination as equally essential to its functioning, the distinctive synthesis underpinning capitalist power. Subsumption and the critique of political economy. If the exaggerations and distortions of these periodizing approaches run into theoretical and empirical problems that ultimately render them untenable, they nonetheless open up important questions regarding the basic structure and development of capitalist societies. Is the dynamic of subsumption driven by the economic logic of accumulation or by the political logic of class antagonism? Or some combination of the two, in which case, how is their combination to be conceptualized? Is the transition from formal to real subsumption an automatic or even necessary implication of capitalist control of production, or just one of its possible modalities? How do processes of subsumption in different areas of the economy and regions of the planet interact and affect one another? Is it coherent or plausible to speak of a total subsumption of society and the individuals composing it? Some aspects of these questions were addressed directly by the so-called labor process debates of the 1970s, Harry Braverman, Burway, Gortz, etc. The common thread linking this, E.P. Thompson, the common thread linking this variegated literature was the combination of a general theorization of capitalist production and its immanent laws, together with an attempt to grasp the shifting composition of capitalist production through a focus on strategies of capitalist control within the labor process. Let me break there for a second, and there's going to be a discussion about the Brighton labor process group, but that's a more local example, but I think you could apply this to the, what David Harvey was talking about in his writings on his anti-capitalist writings and his writings on globalization. But anyway, importantly, significant early contributions to these debates, such as from the Brighton Labor Process Group, rejected any simple correspondence or transposition of the dynamics of subsumption between the level of the individual labor process and the configuration of the social whole, insisting that the relation between capital and labor at a general social level cannot be derived from or reduced to the capital relation within production, whilst the actual structure of the labor process is not historically determined by the abstract logic of capital accumulation, since capitalist production relations can only be reproduced as a totality of social relations. This signaled the urgency of developing a research program that would interrogate the evolving articulation of production and reproduction understood as the totality of the social process, and therefore the wider material context within which the specific struggles over subsumption in production play out. Posing the problem of the economic and political dimensions of capitalist power in other terms, these authors also examined whether the driving force of transformations in the labor process were grounded primarily in the competitive pressure to increase the efficiency of production or in the drive to consolidate control over labor. Recent contributions, such as from Das and also Skillman, have continued this orientation through empirically informed analysis of patterns of transformation in contemporary capitalism's labor processes. Sharing some of these concerns, albeit at a higher level of theoretical abstraction, strands of Marxological scholarship, referred to variously as capital logic, capital-logic, value form theory, and systematic dialectics, have thought to make important clarifications regarding the relationship between Marx's account of subsumption and the framework of his critique of political economy. Building on Hegelian-inspired reconstructions of capital which seek to consolidate the systematic coherence of its central categories, the work of Chris Arthur and Patrick Murray links the dynamic of subsumption to a dialectical exposition of the value forms. We're finally back to value forms, the critique of fetishistic appearances, and the distinction between absolute and relative surplus value production. So, it's circling back to the original Marxian arguments in one sense, emphasizing the inner logical necessity or accumulation driving capitalist production and reproduction. Chris Arthur's account depicts capital as a self-moving system of abstract forms that must shape the material content it subsumes in accordance with this goal. So, a self-moving system of abstract forms. Yet the focus on the systematic completeness of capital here tends toward an objectivism that reduces the antagonistic characteristic of capitalist class relations to a theoretical afterthought. In contrast to Negri, for whom struggle is primary at the expense of structural mediations, etc., see the author's upcoming text. Subsumption is thus treated as a category located internally to the quasi-autonomous systematic dialectic of capital, rather than a category articulating capital with its external foundations, that is, nature and labor. Instead of subsumption naming the relation in which social conflicts over the exploitation of labor are concentrated, in these capital-centric accounts, it becomes one further moment in the consolidation of capital systematic dominance. Whichever way these political stakes of capitalist subsumption are balanced within the ambit of these approaches, an exclusive focus on developing a pure logic of capitalist accumulation elides the question of capitalism as real history and the central role played by subsumption and its concomitant conflicts in determining the trajectory of that history. Finally, a significant and innovative set of engagements with Marx's account of subsumption emerged within Latin American Marxism from the 1970s onward, developing a critical rereading of Marx in parallel and to some degree influenced by their European contemporaries, authors such as Bolivar Echeverria, Armando Bartra, and Enrique Dussel, and highlighted important neglected concepts and esoteric structural aspects of Marxist discourse in order to address the shortcomings of both orthodox Marxism and mainstream bourgeois social theory in its incipient postmodern inflection as much as in its traditional empiricist variants. Of these, Echeverria's contributions are without doubt the most profound, in many respects surpassing any other attempt to situate a theory of subsumption coherently and systematically within the context of Marx's critique of capitalist society. Working closely with Marx's available drafts and notebooks whilst responding inventively to the lacunae, the things missing in Marx's project, for example, around the concept of use value, Echeverria made the case that subsumption, along with the analysis of value, fetishism, and social reproduction, should be situated at the center of Marx's thought. The concept of subsumption has a special importance with respect to the core of Marx's critical discourse, that is to say, the theory of the contradiction between the socio-natural process of production consumption and the socio-capitalist process of the valorization of value. It is the most advanced attempt made by Marx to show in general theoretical terms the way in which these two contradictory processes are articulated. For Echeverria, the contradictory character of capitalist society expressed from the most basic levels of value and use value and abstract concrete labor, right through the complexity of expanded capitalist production and social reproduction, was in each instance articulated as a relation of subsumption of use value under value, concrete under abstract labor, and so on. Subsumption did not therefore figure as a discrete moment in Marx's conceptual construction, but rather traversed the entirety of his exposition in Capital with increasing concreteness. Echeverria's insights went on to be consolidated and extended systematically by Jorge Barraza in relation to the implications of real subsumptions for transformations in the sphere of consumption, where the capitalist development of science and technology leads to an inversion of means of production into means of destruction, that is, from means of securing the reproduction of human life to the means of its negation. Enrique de Sal also places subsumption at the center of his reinterpretation of Marx's critique of political economy, drawing on the background of subsumption in German idealism through, though focusing on Schelling rather than Kant and Hegel, along with Marxist liberation theology. De Sal's argument takes Marx's critique to rest on a dialectic of exteriority and totality in which living labor originally stands outside of the closed totality of capital, but is then incorporated within it through its subsumption under value. Capital thus makes labor a moment in its own development, neutralizing its independence and negating its exteriority. For de Sal, this transition, affected by the exchange of labor for wage, is the key moment in which the being of capital, its social reality, is grounded. In this way, he develops a broadly ontological framework for conceptualizing subsumption with some affinities to Negri, which draws on Marx's description in the Grundrisse of labor as a pure, denuded subjectivity, as absolute poverty or non-being, in contrast to the being of capital. De Sal emphasizes this negativity or nothingness of living labor, which is reduced to a pure potential until it's subsumed and actualized in production, serving as capital's mediation with itself. The subsumptive moment is therefore central to de Sal's entire conception of how capital forms a closed ontological totality, somewhat akin to Chris Arthur's systematic dialectic, as well as to his insistence on the excessive character and resistant capacity of labor, which, despite figuring from the standpoint of that totality as a non-being, can never fully or finally be internalized, given that it is the true but denied ontological foundation of capital. You'll note here that there is no discussion of ideology. Much like Negri, the politics of this argument is mapped onto a Manichaean ontological schema, with the result that rather than being able to give an account of capital's other, that which is subsumed in concrete terms, say, into an account of the current composition of a global working class and the labor processes that function as the site of exploitation, de Sal constructs his critical discourse from the intangible standpoint of a theological negativity, a source that by definition cannot appear positively within his discourse, rather than a force grasped as already present, actively resistant, and practically embedded in the material totality of social life. So, conclusion, following its critical reframing in German idealist philosophy, the category of subsumption acquires a distinctive theoretical status. It simultaneously designates the specificity of a relation of analytic identity between particular and universal, whilst demanding an account of how that relation is produced and evolves through processes of form determination, transforming its own conditions of possibility as a result. This reframing establishes the productivity and difficulty of subsumption for Marxist theory. Subsumption both captures the uniquely conceptual and actually abstract quality of capitalist domination, whilst also in its multiple modalities, designating the diverse social and material processes through which the control and exploitation of labor, as well as the reshaping of production, occurs. Yet Marx's general schema of formal, real, and hybrid subsumption only enumerates the most basic contours of the concrete processes of capitalist form determination. The true effectivity of a theory of subsumption lies in its capacity to provide a framework for further research, both of a more focused and empirically informed nature, that is, grasping the particularities of how the subsumption of labor and nature is configured in diverse scenarios, as well as a synthetic generalizing nature tracing the global articulations between production and reproduction. Pursuing these two trajectories of analysis enables Marx's theory to continually reactivate itself in response to the present, binding a basic account of accumulation with its concomitant notions of class, value, fetishism, ideology, etc., to the novel social forms expressive of capitalism's capacity to adapt and evolve. Yet across all these levels of inquiry, subsumption remains the crucial category of mediation and antagonism, marking the point of articulation and conflict between the abstract system of capitalist forms and the material foundation which it forms and appropriates. The tendency towards absolutization, ontologization, or historicization of subsumption weakens this effectivity by idealistically sundering the basic schema of subordination under capital from the real conditions and struggles in which it has its actuality and potential overcoming. Subsumption cannot provide an answer or resolution to the problems of Marxist theory, only a framework for addressing those problems in a responsive and non-dogmatic manner. Okay, well, I know I probably lost a whole bunch of folks, but this idea of sublation, Aufhebung, it's there. And as I noted in November, the comparison in this particular article to this different article to quantum entanglement gets us even further. But it is a kind of dialectical process and has certain features that resemble, quantum discussions. So that's a kind of interesting thing, and will become more interesting with the evolution of quantum computing. So you can actually raise that interesting question of whether, from a computational point of view, it's not so much about artificial intelligence, although I would assert that the discussion of the algorithm in artificial intelligence is discussing a kind of sublation. And if you think of it that way, all the other Marx stuff actually kind of fits real well. And then if, of course, you talk about other things relative to programming, I think that is also there as possible. So subsumption is an act of subsuming or placing something under a more general category or principle. Now, that's the whole point of, Marx talking about the Hegelian move in that direction, how subsumption operates for Hegel. And yes, there's a whole thing between Hegel and Kant on that, but that once Marx gets hold of it, he tries to say, well, it's structurally interesting and useful and can help describe the kind of process, the concreteness, the transformation of the concrete to the abstract to the concrete again. So what I read from earlier at the beginning was Carlo Versolone, From Formal Subsumption to General Intellect. Recall that we talked about general intellect before. Remember this idea of how it comes up in Marx. Elements for a Marxist reading of the thesis of cognitive capitalism and historical materialism. So this general intellect idea is, the product of subsumption, whatever that might be, if you want to sort of work through that. So this article is actually a very good article, I think. The originality of the general intellect hypothesis as a sublation of real subsumption. I know that's just like gobbledygook, but it's talking about a kind of transformational process where we talk about these ideas have become assimilated. And if you want to use a contemporary example, as I've just asserted, perhaps we can talk, and of course this requires more yammering by a lot of other different people and critique, et cetera, et cetera. But you can talk about the discourse of artificial intelligence, the emergence of sorting of algorithms, the idea of large big data, et cetera, as that kind of ordering process, of a subsuming process, particularly with the onset of large databases, cloud-based computing, et cetera, et cetera. But also the fact that that algorithmic constructions of one type or another actually serve a sublating process. Now, the fact is, what in what ways does that support explicating class antagonisms, etc.? Well, actually, you can see that in the types of language used in large language modeling. It's just to me, it's interesting only because um, things that claim to be AI, have this make this a kind of attempt to do idiomatic expressions and to make it feel conversational. And I think that alone is the deception. It resembles, in fact, a Star Trek thing about that we saw in that we've been watching Star Trek about the in the episode with Data's uh, brother, Lore, and the difference between language use in terms of contractions, etc. He uses contractions, I don't use contractions, and blah 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 blah. Okay, well, I'm going to stop because I've reached my end time. Let me what Marxological scholarship? Yes, indeed, it is. And it's a little complicated, but I think if you actually focus on it, and it helps figure out. I mean, in some places he just goes way off the rails, but I think he's pointing out an important moment, and I think that these help support the idea, and you can see it, and I think it gives the historical underpinnings, which is important, as well as the theoretical or philosophical underpinnings, which I think are also useful to say, sublation um, is really quite central, and you can actually see it in certain kinds of processes. And if you consider language as cultural production, you can actually build a cultural production model that can assimilate all of these things and be dynamic, have consequence. It may leave behind certain ideas about labor, but if you consider that language and language modeling, because it is still about language production ultimately, it doesn't. Large language models don't mean anything unless someone's actually reading the text. Remember that, you know and also the question of um, uh, the replication in speech, which is even more interesting. Siri, Alexa, blah blah blah. So that's another possibility. Until we're all paper clips, yes, indeed. That's kind of. You look like you're having a subsumption problem. Can I help? That's paperclip talking to me. Anyway, I'll stop the share.